tightly, bring only what you need. We will be passing through the fog.
Welcome to episode 2 of the Reflections on Multicultural Competence podcast, where each week mental health professionals are encouraged to reflect on and challenge the narratives we've created about ourselves and others through the socialization process and our experiences with power, privilege, and marginalization based on our many intersecting cultural identities. This self-reflection is a foundation of multicultural competence, that which is required to adhere to ethical standards of doing no harm, and really seeing, hearing, respecting, and appreciating those we serve. I believe that this self-reflection, this understanding oneself more fully as a cultural being with multiple identities, provides the pathway for healing any sense of separation felt within oneself as well as with others. I am your host, licensed psychologist Sonia Lott. This podcast is produced by SimPsych LLC, the company of which I am the founder and CEO. SimPsych LLC is approved by the American Psychological Association to sponsor continuing education for psychologists and offers continuing education in multicultural competence for mental health professionals. I want to tell you that an upcoming workshop on November 1st that SimPsych LLC facilitator Mike Lakier and I are co-facilitating. It's a one-day continuing education workshop called The Influences of Religion and Spirituality on Grief and Mourning, Implications for Grief Counseling. And it's being held at Columbia University in Harlem in the Center for Complicated Grief. Mike and I both completed advanced training in the evidence-based protocol for complicated grief therapy, CGT, and are excited to have received the invitation to present on this topic. I want to be clear here that Mike and I are presenting, but it's not an official SimPsych LLC workshop. The Center for Complicated Grief is the official sponsor for this event, and continuing education credits will be awarded through their program. I'll provide the URL to the Eventbrite webpage for more information and to register in the podcast notes. So, today's episode is devoted to common misconceptions about multicultural competence. But before going deeper into the topic, I want to share that the 3-day workshop in Orlando, Multicultural Competence, a mindfulness-based approach, has been canceled due to low enrollment. Everyone affected by the cancellation has already been notified and refunds are being processed. So, while sitting in the awareness that it's progress and not perfection that I'm reaching for as I continue working to increase brand awareness of SimPsych LLC, I'm reevaluating the marketing strategies that I've used to date. Having only launched SimPsych LLC this summer, I knew that effective marketing would have to focus on brand awareness. But I think I underestimated the challenge involved in marketing in a way that spoke to some of the misconceptions that exist around multicultural competence that may have demonstrated why the type of workshop that was being offered, a 3-day immersion into multicultural competence, was something relevant in some way to all mental health professionals. Okay, so on to the 5 misconceptions. The first misconception I want to mention is the idea that the term multicultural refers only to race and ethnicities. In the 1970s, when multiculturalism first began to be recognized as a fourth force of psychology, that was pretty much true. But since that time, the concept of multicultural has expanded to include a wider range of cultural identities, such as gender identity. Gender, a term used interchangeably with biological sex often. Ability status, religion, spirituality, age, socioeconomic status, and nationality. This expansion in the concept of multicultural is evident in the many versions of multicultural guidelines of all of the professional mental health organizations. A second misconception is that multicultural competence requires only learning about the ways in which they, meaning individuals who are perceived to be or who are identified as a part of a marginalized group, are different from us, the dominant group. One of our ethical responsibilities is to be aware and respectful of differences based on cultural identities. But we also have an ethical responsibility to try to eliminate the effect of our own biases and prejudices in our work as mental health professionals. We can't do this without some ongoing awareness of our own cultural values and biases and an understanding of how they have been shaped by the socialization process and our unique experiences with power, privilege, and marginalization. Multicultural competence at its foundation involves this ongoing awareness. A quote that's coming to mind, one that has been attributed to the Talmud, the sacred text of Jewish law, as well as Anais Nin, the French-Cuban writer best known for her published journals, but also perceived by literary critics as the finest writer of female erotica, is, quote, "We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are," unquote. Our biases and assumptions, having their origin in our early socialization process, make up our worldview, the lens from which we view the world, so to speak. So, if this worldview remains unexamined, we will see others not as they truly are, but as we are. We often assume that because our experience is our experience, it's everybody else's experience too. This becomes particularly problematic when one has privilege and assumes that everyone else experiences the world in the same way that they do, particularly for those who don't experience the world in the same way because of their experience of marginalization. A third misconception is that the 3-credit course on some aspect of multiculturalism that's required in all approved graduate mental health programs gave you everything that you needed to know in order to be multiculturally competent. When I completed my doctoral coursework in an APA-approved program in counseling psychology at Temple University more than 30 years ago, there was no such requirement. However, in more recent years, I've taught this required course in multiculturalism in the Master's Program of Education in Counseling Psychology at Temple University. Teaching this course was a gateway to learning a lot about the obstacles that abound in teaching this course. Many facilitators of the course don't have an adequate degree of multicultural competence, nor the conflict management skills needed to navigate the inevitable conflict that arises during discussions in this type of course. There is often little attention given to helping students increase their awareness of their own assumptions and biases. Also, the course content tends to focus on race and ethnicity to the exclusion of sexual orientation, gender identity, and the concept of intersectionality. There's an excellent 28-minute documentary called Bad Fit, BADFIT, co-produced by licensed psychologist Adi Ben Israel and licensed clinical social worker Jill Kaufman, that speaks to this. The documentary focuses on the prevalence of homophobia, transphobia, and heterosexism in social work education. While the documentary addresses these issues in social work education, it's relevant to many graduate mental health programs. And by the way, you can refer to the podcast notes to find the website links to the full version of the video, as well as the website that has additional information about this documentary. Now back to the 3-credit course. Even when this 3-credit course in multiculturalism is more inclusive and facilitated by professors with high levels of multicultural competence, it's still the beginning of a lifelong journey of growing, because the more we unlearn, the more there is to unlearn. And the more we learn, the more there is to learn. A fourth misconception is that when you're a member of a marginalized group, then your life experiences with marginalization have earned you a Ph.D. in multicultural competence. I believe this is especially true for people of color. Our trauma based on the color of our skin is real, and psychology is beginning to validate this. An excellent example of this is the January 2019 special issue of the American Psychologist. The articles in this special issue introduce new conceptual approaches, research, and healing models to challenge the ongoing racial trauma that people of color and indigenous individuals experience. Still, our trauma doesn't translate into multicultural competence. The idea of multicultural competence through life experiences is very similar to the idea that some individuals with privilege in a particular identity group hold that they have a high level of multicultural competence because their best friend is. You can fill in the blank, but you know what I mean. The truth is that these are individual experiences, and they don't necessarily invite you to reflect on and challenge the narratives or transform the narratives you've created about yourself and others through the socialization process, along with experiences with power, privilege, and marginalization based on our many intersecting cultural identities. As a person of color, your trauma doesn't give you insight into how you might also be using oppressive systems created by dominant groups of which you are a part of, for example, Christianity or heterosexuality, to oppress your, quote, brothers and sisters, unquote, who are of the same socially constructed race, if they are lesbian, gay, bisexual, Muslim, Jewish, or atheist. Nor do your experiences of marginalization based on your skin color automatically bring to your awareness the privileges you have in a dominant group like Christianity or heterosexuality as a result of discrimination having been embedded in every system of which we are a part of. So let me use the legal system to illustrate this. Cisgender individuals who also identify as heterosexual have significantly more rights and protection from discrimination on a federal and often state level than individuals who identify as gender expansive, transgender, lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Now, I live in Pennsylvania, and there are no laws to protect against discrimination in housing, employment, education, or public accommodations if you identify as or are perceived to be gender expansive, transgender, lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Now I want you to really catch that. That means that in the state of Pennsylvania, it's not illegal to discriminate against LGBTQ people in housing, employment, education, nor in public places, not just bathrooms, but also restaurants, retail stores, hotels, and more. There also are not laws that protect LGBTQ youth from being bullied in schools or from conversion therapy, the type of therapy that some religious organizations create to, quote, turn gay straight or help gender expansive individuals to realize they're just confused, unquote. It's interesting, though, because in Pennsylvania, there is a state law banning insurance companies from excluding transgender individuals from health care plans. But ironically, Pennsylvania state employers do not offer medical insurance plans that include transgender coverage for specific medical care unique to transgender individuals. However, Pennsylvania does allow for what is referred to as gender marker updates or changes to gender identification on both driver's license and birth certificates. I want to share just a little bit more about state laws. Are you aware that there are only 7 states, along with the District of Columbia, that offer protection against discrimination in housing, employment, education, and public accommodations based on gender identity and sexual orientation, along with protection against bullying in schools, and also allows for gender marker updates for both driver's licenses and birth certificates, and also have made conversion therapy illegal? In other words, did you know that there are only 7 states, along with the District of Columbia, that offer, quote, equal rights, unquote, to people based on their sexual orientation and gender identity? So just for your information, I want to identify what these 7 states are, in addition to the District of Columbia. They're California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Nevada, New York, Oregon, and Washington. Now, there are also 9 states in the country that offer no protection against discrimination in any area based on sexual orientation or gender identity. These states are Alabama, Georgia, Missouri, Minnesota, Montana, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, and Wyoming. No protection at all against discrimination in any area for people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or gender expansive. I want to emphasize something else here. Those of you who identify as lesbian, bisexual, or gay, but also are white, your ongoing experiences of trauma as a result of prejudice and discrimination based on your sexual orientation does not negate the privilege you have based on your skin color either. My point here to everyone is that we all still have work to do now and always in regard to multicultural competence. Our paths are just different based on our unique narratives that we've created about ourselves and others through our socialization processes and our individual experiences with power, privilege, and marginalization based on our many intersecting cultural identities. Now, a fifth misconception is that multicultural competence is only relevant when you are working with someone who is different from you in some obvious way. I believe that every experience is a multicultural experience, even if the person you are interacting with self-identifies in the same ways that you do. And here's why. Every one of us has membership in all cultural identities: race, sexual orientation, age, ability, status, socioeconomic status, and so on, whether we self-identify or are categorized by others. But the cultural identities that are most salient to one individual differs person to person. Also, the intersection of an individual's multiple identities with their variable experiences of privilege and marginalization and the narratives they've created are unique to each individual. This is why I believe that every experience really is a multicultural experience. And if this is true, it's not really possible to know all that we need to know about any individual that we're working with. But when we attend continuing education trainings that focus on, quote, understanding particular marginalized groups, unquote, we often end up learning a lot of stereotypes about the group at the expense of appreciating the complexities involved in understanding any one person within that group. This is why I always come back to starting first with you, doing your own work, understanding who you are as a multicultural being. Doing your own work in this way can also be an invitation to a path of transformation within yourself, and I think that's the real beauty of this often challenging and honestly messy work. So, the sixth and final misperception discussed in this episode is that your good intentions are what matter most. They're not. Remember that quote I mentioned toward the beginning of the podcast? We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. It's definitely relevant here. You can do a lot of harm not meaning to, and like privilege, harm is often invisible. Okay, before moving to our reflection for this episode, I think taking a deep breath in and slowly exhaling would be a good thing. Okay, here's a reflection for episode 2. If you're driving, it's probably a good idea to keep driving and try this reflection later. However, if you're not driving, it's a good idea to sit down with your feet flat on the floor, your spine straight, and body as relaxed as possible. Take a few more deep breaths and slowly release them. Now, think about the 6 misperceptions discussed in the episode. That the concept multicultural refers only to race and ethnicity. Multicultural competence requires only learning about the ways in which they are different from us. That 3-credit course in multiculturalism gave you everything you needed to be multiculturally competent. Being a part of a marginalized group or having a friend who is has given you a Ph.D. in multicultural competence. And your good intentions are what matter most. Have you held any of these misconceptions? If so, which one has felt most true for you? What do you think might be the source of this belief? If you still hold this belief, what do you think would have to happen for you to reconsider the accuracy of this belief? If this belief has already shifted, what do you believe allowed you to open to a shift in this belief? All right, episode 3 is coming to an end. The next episode will focus on ways to challenge these misperceptions that prevent us from recognizing the need to do our own work and opening up to receiving the rewards that can come from this challenging and often messy work. I'm referring to cultural humility and mindfulness. Just as a reminder, check out the information about the November 1st Continuing Education Workshop that Michael Kier and I are co-facilitating at Columbia University's Center for Complicated Grief in Harlem on the influences of religion and spirituality on grief and mourning, implications for counseling. Now, I hope you will subscribe to this podcast as well as share this and future episodes with your friends and family and colleagues and everybody you know on social media. I also hope that you will sign up for the SimPsych newsletter to stay up to date on upcoming workshops and podcast episodes. You'll find the link to the SimPsych LLC newsletter sign up in the podcast notes. Finally, please consider leaving an honest review of this podcast with one caveat. Because the subject matter of the podcast includes challenging topics, I want to encourage you to reflect on what you are reacting to, even if it's something positive, first. And consider how does it fit or not fit with your already existing worldview. And as always, I offer my deepest gratitude to the beautiful composer and songstress Tina Malia for giving me permission to use portions of her song, The Lost Frontier, from the CD of the same title, as the intro and outro of this podcast. Check out her website at www.tinamalia.com.
Sirens echo in the mist. Will we hand it to our daughters? Will we take it for ourselves? When the stories are told,